Hello, everyone. Welcome into another episode of Bold Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. My name is Alex. As always, we are here to talk about the Chargers' 34-20 win over the Raiders. I'm here in a little bit of a different setup today in a hotel room with some family. I've been on vacation. You probably see my face is a little red, a little bit between tan and red. But I've been on some vacation here with some family, so spending some R&R time. But I still told them, hey, I need that hotel room and the internet to work for me for 30 or 40 minutes so I can record bolt breakdowns both today and after the Texans game on Saturday. And they were just like, sure, whatever the fuck a bolt breakdowns is. But here we are nonetheless. Yeah, it was a pretty good win to obviously watch yesterday. I think in the first half, particularly some things that they had to struggle through. We talk about Slater obviously being absent, the reshuffling of the line, alt to left tackle, Slater, right guard, Pipkins playing tackle. And definitely from the offensive line standpoint, they had their struggles in the first half with some penalties. The defense was getting cooked by Jacoby Myers at first. But then, just notably, there were things that, started to turn in the game. It really felt like once they got that field goal drive, I think that made it, I think it was 10-9. I felt that once they got that and they just got through one drive without an offensive line penalty, because the yards were there taking for the Raiders. Look, like they're starting practice squad corners, right? Like this wasn't the toughest defense to play, but I think it was a little bit about the Chargers getting out of their own way on some of these plays. And the Raiders, to their credit, were still, playing hard for a majority of that game. Obviously, it might pop out on the push notifications on my computer here in a little bit, but they still potentially could move on or keep Antonio Pierce. Players and coaches were both fighting for their jobs yesterday, right? So not a pushover game, for the Chargers in that respect. Obviously, you could talk about the level of opponent and stuff like that. The last couple of weeks, the Patriots obviously were kind of very disoriented as well. But look, you win in the league, you win the league, right? And this was a Raiders team that came out like they did kind of want to win. And really, until that drive, which kind of ended the first half, where they get the Dayon interception, which great read to kind of jump, right through the seam there and figure out kind of where AOC was going with that ball, almost like before he threw it, was right there to kind of jump on it. So great, turnover and interception there. And then that obviously turns into the Chargers score on that drive, in which DJ Chark gets a touchdown, which DJ Chark has a pulse in 2025. Things are already different in 2025 than they were in 2024. Obviously, he's been contributing more on offense from a snap standpoint because of the injury to Jalen Reagor recently. So the Chargers have sort of had to play him. So nice to see him. It was only one catch. It's not something that's going to revolutionize the wheel, but just to know, okay, this is a player that we can kind of count on near the red zone, right? And then, I mean, the lead story of the game, which we'll get to in a second, is Quentin Johnston. First in that sequence, though, and I'm sure the guys already talked about it on the live stream, but the Herbert throw back across his body to Ladd on the 2-point conversion was incredible. I was almost like, it just seems like, oh my God, this is a dead play. They're going to go in a half 15-10. Okay, but they get the ball. And then as soon as, you see Herbert let go of it, it's like, oh, well, okay, he's actually going to try to throw it in play, not just chuck it out of bounds. And you see Ladd streaking across in the back of the end zone. Just great stuff to see all around for an offense that I think was just searching for their momentum a little bit in the first half. And it really felt like once they got to that point in the game, they weren't giving anything back to the Raiders. And then obviously they end up closing it out in the fourth quarter with the big Justin Herbert run. Makes it 27-13. And really they kind of dominated the tempo, I would say, from late third quarter into the fourth quarter. It is kind of when they really took over the game from that regard. But I think that moment and that touchdown drive after the interception and not just settling for 3 points there before the end of the half again was such a huge mental win for the Chargers in that moment where they had been, kind of struggling to sort of finish some of these drives. So great stuff all around there. The player that we have to talk about is Quentin Johnston, who before this game, I, talked about it with Dan Popper a little bit on Twitter, who started tweeting, this is Quentin Johnston's first, his second 100-yard game, all that. And I was like, I think this is Quentin Johnston's first 10-plus reception game, too. And then Popper replied to me with, this is his first more than 5 reception game, right? Because he had that 118-yard game against Cleveland earlier this season, which was his first 100-yard game, but it was only on 4 receptions. So this is really the first time in QJ's career that he was kind of asked to be a volume receiver, and the first time he was, really performed kind of on that ask. And so major credit to him. 13 receptions, 186 yards. I think in the PFF live grading, tool, they gave him like a 90 receiving grade. He 5.26 yards per route run or something like that. He was just phenomenal to watch yesterday. And it was nice to see him get confidence back, I think, in terms of just being a guy who could be force-fed, whether it's, the go ball down the sideline, which, how many times have we seen the QJ go ball and then like either it wasn't the greatest throw, or it's right in his body and he dropped it, and then all the kind of complications that there's been on that connection to try to get him those shots. And look, like the Greg Roman offense, regardless of, hey, we want to do shallow crossers with QJ, we want to do this, we want to do mesh concepts, like sometimes you just got to go down the field and catch a go ball, right? And so it was nice for QJ to get that win in that moment, which I just imagine had to feel really good for him. And Herbert talked about it, after the game. He's playing the right football at the right time. And he's a true professional in terms of how he has bounced back, I think, from that Baltimore game. Clearly, I think the last month of the season has not been his best month necessarily. I think he hadn't had a 50-yard game since that Cleveland game, but no Palmer in this game, and ultimately we don't know what Palmer's status is for the playoff game. To have this kind of a game from QJ was both necessary from QJ's standpoint and the Chargers, who need as many receiving options, whether it's kind of their starting caliber receivers, whether it's their supplementary guys going forward. This was a performance that it was needed for him. And hey, is it going to come as easy against, Derek Stingley and some of those guys in Houston next week? Probably not. But, I don't think the story of this game is, oh my God, QJ has to be, a 100-yard receiver every game. But I think it's just, you have to think about, or, it's better if the defense can think about QJ in that context where he's a receiver that, hey, if we leave the coverage too soft on him, if we deviate the coverage to Ladd, then he's a guy who can, get his own yards too, right? So that, I think, is really what is kind of the win for the Chargers in that regard. And for QJ, ultimately, to not have any drops in this game, probably a big confidence booster for him in that regard, mentally as well, heading into the playoffs where, hey, those windows to catch, those windows to throw are going to get a lot smaller, right? And so, nice for QJ to get, like I mentioned, some momentum going into the playoffs. Other notable offensive storylines that I think really stood out in this game. One kind of under the radar one. I don't know if it's under the radar, but the final rushing numbers from this game ended up being, I believe, Dobbins. Let me just check the box score, because at some point in the fourth quarter, I believe, or maybe it was late third, I think it was the fourth, they pulled Dobbins after he got the 58-yard incentive for the 900-yard season. And then they basically just threw Haskins out there to finish the game. Haskins had 12 carries, I think, for 38 yards, something like that. But obviously, it was used as a pass protector and things as well. But I thought it was interesting because he has been very similar volume to Kamani for the last number of games. And really, that Broncos game seems like it was kind of the turning point of like, okay, he has the big receiving score in that game. And that really felt like the coaching staff kind of being a little bit more comfortable with him being on the field. Pass protection is an area where I do think right now Haskins has kind of the advantage over Kamani. So even though he's not necessarily as explosive, he's not necessarily someone who's going to contribute their offense. He is someone that is a floor raiser with the pass protection and kind of everything else he does outside of running as well from a special team standpoint, and they trust him to kind of do those things. So I thought it was very notable, especially because Gus Edwards' injury with the ankle is he going to be back by that playoff game, which is now kind of on a short week. We'll see. But that was a very promising sign, I think, going forward that Haskins was able to kind of hold his own in this game. I'd like to see fewer kind of like Haskins fullback dives. I don't know why when they get to the 1 yard line, it's like, yeah, that's the playbook. But that kind of wore on me in this game a little bit. But I do think Haskins has been productive. But I think it is notable, like I said, if Gus cannot go in that playoff game, which is a possibility. Obviously, I think they've kind of rested him the most recent 2 weeks because they ideally would like him to be available for that Texans game. But, there is a possibility, at least, that he's not. And it seems like it will be JK and Haskins doing duties if that is the case. And then JK, Gus, and Haskins, assuming Gus can go. So we'll see how all of that pans out. Obviously, they'd like to have Gus just as a guy that I think has been in the playoffs before, has been in those big moments before. So again, we'll see how that kind of all pans out. Trying to think of other offensive storylines. Obviously, a very good Herbert game. We haven't talked about kind of the offensive line problems fully yet because we do have to talk about the Slater thing. So they put Alt at left tackle in this game. They put Sally at right guard, and they put Pipkins at right tackle. And it did feel like they had some struggles, certainly at the beginning with offensive penalties. There was a time in the game where I was just like, all right, guys, like you can't be having these like drive killers each time you're trying to go down the field. And I think part of that was definitely not having Slater. You're moving alt positions, you're changing things up. And they definitely struggled with defensive stunts in the beginning, particularly along the Raiders' defensive line. So that was something that I certainly noticed in this one. But then as things got more comfortable, that field goal drive, they had to make it 10-9. I think was like the first drive they didn't have some sort of offensive line penalty or mix-up or things like that. And it's like, okay, it's not perfect yet, but it's like, there's signs of it going in the right direction here. And then they obviously get the touchdown drive before the half. So it was nice to see them go kind of in the right direction there as far as the offensive line for everything that it could be this game kind of without Slater. Now, we do have to talk about Pipkins going down, I believe, in the late third, early fourth quarter. Then they throw Foster Sorrell into the right guard spot, or I forget exactly what they did. Sorrell, I think, played right tackle because then Salyer went to guard. So I just want to double check that they did put Sorrell at right tackle and then kicked Pipkins or kept Pipkins at that guard spot. So that was a little interesting wrinkle. They had Sorrell play right guard a little bit last week against the Patriots. So again, the movement of the offensive line, and then obviously the main concern is the injury to Trey, and then hopefully he can be back for the postseason. Obviously, he gets carted off, so that's not, we don't know exactly what his injury is, other than the team just putting out that it was an oblique injury. Obviously, him getting carted off is not the best sign probably going forward for his availability on Sunday. As the much maligned as I think Pipkins has been this year, the valleys and peaks of his game have been kind of a roller coaster in that regard. I do think he is a good asset for them to have, even if he maybe, wouldn't, they could debate where he would start, whether that's guard or tackle. And obviously you have this, Slater thing going forward that they'll have to monitor with the knee. It would have been nice to just have Pipkins for the sake of the depth of this offensive line, even if he wasn't necessarily a starter. And the plan maybe going into this week would have been Salyer at right guard had the Slater thing not happened. We don't know. But unfortunate injury for him. And I do hope, Trey heals up going forward and can contribute at least something on this playoff run. We don't know. So that was kind of the offensive line struggling, but the offensive line, I think, figuring out stuff and picking up steam on the fly, which is kind of what we've seen them do. Particularly, I remember back to the Denver game where things started off, a little bit rough for them too, and then they kind of bounced back. So they certainly absorbed a lot of the, contact and a lot of the stuff that the Raiders were giving them at first, and then figured out things a little bit in the second half. So credit to getting through this game without Slater, for everybody who did play. And then, of course, I do think Slater is the big storyline to watch going forward. Because, look, if you are going to make a deep playoff run this year, Rashawn Slater has to be in the picture. I don't want to overreact to them holding him out as a precaution, but it is a little bit concerning when you hear discomfort in the knee and then he's getting an MRI, presumably today. So that is something I'm not going to, promote fear or worry about necessarily. But it is something that I do think is something to watch going forward. And obviously they have a short week this week. So the offensive line kind of, again, has to figure out some things as far as who's going to be available, who's not going to be available. And basically, first day of practice, what is our optimal, offensive line from, left tackle to right tackle, whether that involves Slater, it doesn't involve Slater, whether that involves Pipkins, if that doesn't involve Pipkins. We'll see what happens there. But obviously a challenge for the Chargers going forward. But I think they have shown you enough the next 2 weeks that they are versatile enough to figure it out. Obviously, the Texans with Danielle Hunter, with Will Anderson, that is a different level of challenge than the defensive lines they've played the last 2 weeks. But I do still think you like the improvisational nature and how the Chargers have figured out things in that regard. But overall, good day offensively in terms of obviously the QJ game, which we talked about, the Herbert game, which we talked about, kind of maybe one of Herbert's more quiet games, but that 2-point conversion was absurd. And it might just be we kind of take Herbert for granted sometimes, but some of the dots he's throwing to QJ and Ladd that were, just really impressive. I think the last 3 weeks on tape in particular have been some of the best stuff we've seen from Herbert all season. So nice to see that he's kind of playing at the right time too, as a passer who's not afraid to just kind of uncork the ball or, and is smart enough to avoid turnovers. So, there's an implicit trust factor with Herbert. Obviously he's going to be fine. But just to see this offense gelling well with him as a passing offense, even if they're not getting the most rushing production, obviously what they're going to need in the postseason. Defensively, not quite as many storylines that I think come to mind for me. Dayon obviously getting the interception was great. Pass rush pressure definitely felt like it got a little bit better in the second half. They really kind of shut down the Raiders' run game a little bit. Probably not necessarily like the level that you would want the pass rush to be, but I also think that the Raiders were very clear with their game plan, which was just AOC, hey, like, get out the ball quick. So there wasn't that many opportunities to kind of harass the quarterback in that way. And I'm kind of curious what Bobby Slowick's plan is also going to be next week, which, with Stroud in that regard as well, to sort of avoid this Chargers pass rush and some of the simulated pressure stuff that Mitchell does. Wouldn't shock me, especially with their concerns at receiver, if their game plan is a little bit similar in that regard of just, trying to get the ball out very quickly, avoid some of the pressure from Mac, from Bosa, from all these guys. Obviously, the Texans' offensive line, I don't think the Texans' offensive line has been as good as it has been in previous years, but obviously they still have Tunsil. They still have, some experience, tested veteran, depth there. So we'll kind of see how that game goes. I do think that they will try to kind of almost play a similar game to what the Raiders did in the first half a little bit in terms of avoiding it. But we'll see. Defensively in the secondary, I thought things were a little worrisome at first because it's like, Christian Fulton is kind of getting burned a couple times. Jacoby Myers was kind of going off in the first half, and they end up leading 10-3 on that touchdown. But it felt like once the middle of the defense settled in, once the secondary settled in, there wasn't too much breathing room for the Raiders to just have downfield. And so that was, a positive sign to see for the defense going forward. I did want to point out one of my favorite moments defensively, which was when Brock Bowers went up for that ball in the end zone, and then you had Derwin also go up midair with him. I tweeted the meme on Twitter where it was you had kind of a Godzilla versus King Kong, where both of these guys collide midair and are trying to hold on to the ball. Regardless of what you think of the Raiders, Brock Bowers was obviously one of our favorite players to watch throughout college and the draft process this year. So him versus Derwin in that moment and some of the other ones in this game was very fun to watch. So shout out to him. I think he broke the Malik Neighbors record that was set an hour ago for most receptions by a rookie in a season ever, which is pretty impressive. So yeah, I think defensively, this was a game that it was a nice little tune-up for the Chargers. I don't know, again, sort of with where this Raiders team is, was this a game that prepped the Chargers for what they're going to get from, some of these playoff teams, including the Texans? No, I think obviously their roster is better, but this was a game that I think you wanted to see them continue the same game plan, the same, schematic approach that they had in the Denver game, in the New England game, and they did that. So ultimately, I think there's not much to criticize the Chargers on in that regard, once they kind of got things going. I did, well, okay, I have one small complaint, but it's not necessarily the biggest one, but the Chargers situationally did do some. We've talked about the Harbaugh situational stuff this year, and let me find it. It was the field goal. They get down to the Vegas 1-yard line, and they have the sequence of Haskins falling forward. They have some Dobbins runs, and ultimately they get down to the 1-yard line up, I think 17-10 in this one. Yeah, this was their first drive out of the half. Kind of this long, winding drive. They get down to the 1 and they opt to kick a field goal, which I think they knew to some extent. They trusted their defense, and they did not really have to, keep scoring touchdowns to be able to contend with the Raiders. That being said, I didn't like the decision to take the field goal there in that moment, especially when you think about it from a playoff perspective. It's look, if you do that against the Chiefs, if you do that against the Texans, if you do that against any of these teams, Like, they're going to make you kind of pay for, taking 3 usually, as opposed to, trying to score 7, especially when you're in that down goal and distance. And the whole thing, if you're on the 1-yard line, is like, okay, well, we back this team up all the way on their own 1. If they don't get it, obviously, if the Raiders drive 99 yards down the field, then okay, like, you look dumb. But I do think that they figured out that the Raiders just weren't going to respond that much in this game. So then they were like, all right, we'll take the field goal. So I just think there's not that consistent of a game management philosophy sometimes, because you also look at what they did last week versus the Patriots, and they went for it 4th and 3 twice against the Patriots, across the 50-yard line, in a game where the Patriots weren't going to respond a ton offensively either. So I guess I just sort of wish that there was a little bit more consistency in their approach. Not that you have to be aggressive all the time, or you have to be conservative all the time. But in that moment, I was thinking about it during the game, and hey, it doesn't matter. They won anyway. But thinking about it from a playoff standpoint, that was a decision that irked me a little bit, and maybe would have irked me a little bit more, right? Like, if this was a big playoff game with big playoff implications. So, we'll see how that goes. But that was really kind of my only real complaint, I guess, from this game, if I had a level one, other than some of the offensive line struggles we talked about. But nice little confidence boosting win here, I think, all things considered. You had Ladd go off, you had QJ go off, Herbert go off. Dobbins looking pretty good heading into the postseason after he had been on IR for a couple weeks. Hopefully, I will pray for it as I go to sleep. Slater's knee is okay, because that, again, is a huge cornerstone of their playoff run. And then I think the defense ended up figuring some things out, and Derwin did good. You look at Dayon, who I did want to make a point about this on the show today, was not named a Pro Bowler. He was not named a Pro Bowl alternate. And I'm usually not like snubs guy. I try not to be like, oh, my favorite player didn't make the Pro Bowl. Like, people were complaining about Dicker versus Boswell. And like, honestly, I think Boswell kind of deserved the nom at kicker for, how hard it is to kick in Pittsburgh. He had a tremendous season. So that wasn't one where I was like, oh my God, he got snubbed, right? Although would have been nice to see Dicker get rewarded. He did get the Pro Bowl alternate status, so I wasn't as mad about that one. But Dayon not getting Pro Bowl alternate even, like, I think he had an argument potentially over Zaire Franklin from the Colts, who got it. They gave it to Roquan and Zaire. But to not even get a Pro Bowl alternate nomination shocked me. Now, I think there is a thing where we look from different things from linebackers, and I think in terms of their coverage ability and their all-around game than maybe some of the league does, right? If you just count tackles, because Zaire Franklin was a good linebacker for the Colts this year. I don't want to take that away, but I think Dayon had the better all-around season than him, in my opinion, in terms of the stuff that he was doing on tape every week. You could go through, I think you go through Mack and you go to Derwin and then you go to Dayon. Really is the third most important player on this defense. And I really just think it showed up in the tape every week. So I was not surprised that he wasn't a Pro Bowler, but I was shocked that he was not a Pro Bowl alternate. And then Bradley Bozeman and Joey Bosa as Pro Bowl alternates was not surprising to me on the basis of their name brand value, because like everybody kind of has known Joey Bosa and Bozeman for longer. But I was like, okay, if this is a meritocracy and we're just saying who were the best players, I'm not exactly sure how those guys got Pro Bowl alternate over Dayon, but I'll let that rest for a minute. So anyway, very excited to be in the playoffs. I do want to get to your guys' questions here. I put out a thread on Twitter, knowing that I was going to record both breakdowns, and I allowed you guys to kind of submit some questions as we go over here. So let's see. I wanted to just take a couple questions from you guys before we close out the pod. This one comes from Elja JP8. I'm all for giving Rashawn an extension, but with his injury history, do you think he still becomes the highest paid tackle in the league? I think for the moment we are overblowing the injury thing. Obviously, something else could come out right after I record this podcast, and we're talking about a big structural injury. I don't believe that to be the case for now. Obviously, you can talk about Rashawn's availability through the pec injury, the bicep injury, or stuff over the years. But I think Rashawn will still become the highest paid left tackle in the league. Steven and Tyler did the show the other day talking about how he might be the best offensive player in the Chargers, Justin Herbert division or non-Justin Herbert division. I think he's been that good and that integral to the team's success. You don't let, a tackle like that walk. And I do think they will extend him to a contract that is becoming of the highest paid tackle in the league. So unless something more severe about his injury comes out, I think we're kind of all good there. Zach McNutt, what do you think their approach to the receiver and DB room will be in the offseason? I think the DB room is not necessarily a revolutionizing the wheel approach. I think you could see them go for some safeties and corners in the draft. Obviously, I do think it's a decent draft for those positions. Maybe you see them obviously bring back Fulton potentially in free agency or pursue some other guys on the corner market there. But they kind of already have the basis of what you're going to do next year with Derwin, with Alohi, with the corners and Tarheeb and Cam, who are obviously both going to be back next year. So I think it's just kind of about making the more marginal changes in both of those vicinities, figuring out what you want to do at slot corner if you're maybe not running it back with John Taylor, although he's technically under contract for next year. And then for wide receiver, I think for wide receiver at this point, I would think about, I think you probably spend in free agency for that position. I'm not saying, go get T. Higgins. I don't even know if T. Higgins is going to be available, and all the reports seem to indicate that the Bengals would rather keep T. Higgins than let him walk. But I do think you probably need a borderline just offensive starter guy who can come in and give you reps. Darius Slayton is a guy I think about in that regard. Amari Cooper is a guy who can still give you some good outside performance and probably won't be, again, as expensive as a Higgins or somebody like that. So those are some kind of realistic names I think about as a guy who can just handle the business on the outside while Ladd cooks in the slot, which I think is ideally what they're kind of looking for in free agency. And I think with the emergence of Ladd, people have talked about the Keenan comeback for a little bit too. There's been reports that Keenan wants to play in LA and stuff like that because he lives here. If it doesn't work out in Chicago, but I kind of think it's at the point where the Keenan reunion doesn't really make that much sense if you're going to have Ladd eating up as much slot volume as he is. So I'd rather kind of have an outside receiver who can do some more of those things. It's just a little bit of a tricky wide receiver market though, because you've had Diggs go down, who had the season-ending injury, and then there's a wide receiver I'm forgetting about who. There was another wide receiver who I'm thinking about that, also. Trying to remember who it is off the top of my head. Godwin also had the season-ending injury. That is who I was thinking about for 2025. And there's other names that you can list off, but interesting wide receiver class because I think outside of Higgins, there's not necessarily a market-setting guy. Assuming Higgins actually makes free agency, we'll see about that. But overall, I think it's a decent enough free agent class for the Chargers to get a guy in addition to whatever they decide to do in the draft. But I don't think it's a draft where, last year, okay, first, second round, that guy's an instant impact guy. I think this wide receiver class is a lot more spotty in that regard. At Diogenes the Cynic, Ace Primero on Twitter, many players on this year's roster were signed to one-year contracts, obviously talking about Dobbins and Fulton and Poona Ford, Fulton, all those. Bozeman is in that list too. Which one should stay? Which ones deserve to be extended, and will they stay? Um, I think Poona Ford is top priority. Like him and Dobbins might be 1A, 1B. I do think they will probably retain both of those players. I think it gets interesting on the margins. What do they decide to do with Fulton, who has dropped off a little bit, I would say, as the season's gone on? And then do they want to run it back with Bozeman, which there's another question. We'll get to that in a second. Dark Samus asks, do you see the playoffs expanding to 16 teams, doing away with the future first round bye? Is this likely to happen in the future? I don't like any league expansion at this point. I already think 17 games is too much, and they're going to go to 18 at some point. But like, at some point, you're kind of just diluting the product a little bit. I mean, it's like, I don't really know if we've seen a competitive 7th seed to this point in the expanded playoffs. And right now, it's like the Broncos and the Bills, which maybe they pull off an upset. The Packers are the 7th seed in the NFC, and they're a solid team. But like, I kind of liked when the playoffs was 6 teams more, just because I don't know if we've had a ton of deserving 7 seeds, but obviously the league isn't going to go backwards, and if they added another playoff team, I wouldn't be surprised. I do still think they should keep the first round bye, though. Like, that is a reward for playing as well as you played the whole season, and I know we as a Chargers, fan base, because of the Chiefs, have not gotten to experience that for ourselves, but that is a reward for being as dominant in the season as you do have. So I do still think the top team or the top 2 teams, or however they want to reckon that out in the future, is still deserving of that. Maddie Knows Ball asks, interior offensive line clearly still massively inconsistent unit even with injuries. Do you see all 3 starters being replaced this offseason? If so, who looks good in the draft or free agency? I'll just answer this with the replacement question. I think Zion is staying at left guard. I think he has shown enough in the second half of the season to probably run it back with him again as a guy that was, a promising first-round pick in the league. I would be very surprised if they moved on from him next year. Even though, I think the first half of the season was definitely a little bit questionable. He definitely has bounced back a little bit. Bozeman is really the one that I think could go either way in terms of like running it back with him on, pretty like team-friendly deal that's a slight raise over what he got this year, but then you could still bring in a guy to kind of like push him for that center job. That is kind of where I lean, but that's like the most 50-50. Do they let him walk? Does he walk into next year as the starter type of conundrum? And then Pipkins, obviously thoughts and prayers with him given the injury and stuff like that. But I do think Pipkins' contract was kind of purposely set up by Telesco to ultimately be a 3-year deal that was really a 2-year deal. And so I think if I'm correct, I can double check the over the cap on this, but really I think they save something like $7 million by cutting Trey next year, if I'm correct. They would save 6.75 against the cap with 2.5 in dead money. So ultimately, they would save about $4 or $5 million by cutting Trey, and $7 million in kind of raw cap savings. So I don't think that he's back next year, and I don't think he showed enough, unfortunately, really at guard or like swing tackle. Maybe they could like cut him and kind of renegotiate his deal with like, the fact that he doesn't have guaranteed money left necessarily on his contract. But we'll see what happens there. So I think Zion's back. Bozeman's kind of 50-50, and then Pipkins probably is not back at this point. But that'll do it for me today, guys. 40 minutes. Very excited about this playoff run. Very excited about this team. Great win over the Raiders. I remember sitting on this podcast with Steven, Tyler, and Arjun in some very, very dark times, particularly after the Jaguars game a couple of years ago, in which we didn't know what the direction of this team was. We talked about, moving on from leadership at that point. It took another year from them to actually do it. But it feels rewarding as a fan base to finally be in a position where not that I agree with everything Harbaugh does or agree with every move Ortiz makes, but you have confidence in the leadership going forward. And I think that is such a huge monumental sea change with the culture and everything. We've talked about Harbaugh ad nauseum. We've talked about all of the changes that they've made to how the program is run, bringing in Ben Herbert and all that stuff. It makes you feel confident that there's football people, as Harbaugh says, I like football, and guys who like football like me. It makes you feel confident that there's guys who really care and are really tactful with their jobs running this franchise. And hopefully this is not a one-off playoff run. Hopefully there's many playoff runs to come in the future. But I think, the big lesson for me to learn as a Chargers fan this year is, okay, like we can trust this structure. We can trust this franchise. Whatever happens in that Texans game, this is a team that's going to be around for a while and be in a position to compete for some titles. Hopefully at some point, kind of down the road, or maybe they go on some Giants-like run this year, like those teams. But this was a big year for believing in Chargers football again. And it makes me emotional, kind of just thinking about, where we've gone all the way from the Raiders game, the 63-21 to now. It's been a long ride, and I'm happy to have, through Twitter, through here, through writing at Bolt Beat, to be able to do this with you guys. It's really a pleasure, and it's something that makes me excited to get out of bed in the morning and still, attack every day, like Jim Harbaugh says. So thank you guys for watching. Really excited to cover this playoff season. We'll see where it takes us. And one last time, in tribute to Antonio Pierce, whether he makes it with the Raiders or not, Raiders!